Office. So you've heard a description of the cap and trade program from ARB, and I won't get into any of those details. Instead, my testimony today is going to focus on three questions that you'll want to keep in mind when thinking about cap and trade. And that first question is, number one, how does cap and trade actually work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And again, the primary goal of AB 32 is to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. So you'll want to think about, how does this actually work? The second question is, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, does it matter how allowances are introduced into the market? In other words, does it matter if they're auctioned or if they're given away for free? And then the third question that you'll want to think about is, does the risk of economic leakage outweigh the potential disadvantages of freely allocating allowances? So let's go to the first question. How does cap and trade reduce greenhouse gas emissions? The aspect that is most central to this question is the cap itself and understanding how the cap works. So what do we mean when we say the cap? What that means is it's the amount of aggregate annual emissions allowed from all covered entities collectively. And so over time, the cap will gradually decline from just over 400 million tons of CO2e allowed, carbon dioxide equivalent, down to 341 million tons of CO2e by 2020. So as the cap declines, the number of allowances that ARB makes available will decline proportionately. And in order to comply with the cap, as you know, covered entities must possess one allowance, or the equivalent thereof, for every ton of GHG emissions that it emits in a given period. As the cap declines and allowances become more scarce over time, allowance prices will likely increase, which in turn creates a greater incentive for covered entities to look for ways to reduce their emissions in order to avoid the need to purchase relatively more expensive allowances. As such, it's the declining cap that forces the reduction in the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, turning to the second question, in terms of reducing our emissions, does it matter how allowances are distributed? Generally speaking, allowances could be distributed in one of three ways. Number one, all available allowances could be given away for free up to the level of the cap, and that's referred commonly to 100% allocation, free allocation. Secondly, all available allowances could be auctioned. And then third, some portion could be freely allocated while the other could be auctioned, and that is the method that ARB is going to be using. I will point out that in the beginning of the program, as Mr. Corey pointed out, most of those allowances will be given away for free, but over the life of the program, what you're actually looking at is about 50% that will be freely allocated while the other half is auctioned. So as we move through the program, there will be fewer freely allocated. Now, all these approaches will achieve the required GHG reduction set by the declining cap. Again, because it's the declining cap on emissions that reduces the state's overall level of GHG emissions, not the manner in which the allowances are distributed. So to reiterate, there is no need for the state to actually raise revenue in order to achieve our GHG emission goals. There's an important point that I need to clarify here too. When we talk about 100% free allocation, we don't mean that covered entities will receive 100% of the allowances they need to comply with the program through 2020. Instead, what we mean by that is that all available allowances are distributed freely. So keeping in mind that available allowances are only equal to the cap. As the cap declines, so too will the number of available allowances decline. And as such, even with 100% free allocation, covered entities must still find a way to reduce their emissions or purchase allowances from someone else who's figured out how to reduce their emissions and thus has excess allowances. So questions 1 and 2 are integrally related and are very important to keep in mind. In the hearing today, you're going to hear about the merits of doing an auction and the merits of doing a free allocation. And while we are currently looking at what these merits are and can talk to you more about that in the future, for now, I would encourage you to ask participants in today's hearing the third and final question, which is this. If you weigh the potential for economic leakage and the economic impacts associated with it against the potential disadvantages of freely allocating allowances, which has the potential to be more harmful? Our office is yet to answer this question, but we are looking into it, and we're, again, happy to share that information with you once we've arrived at our conclusions. But for the time being, we would encourage you to ask participants that very question here today. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions.
Senator Dutton.
Kind of curious about the acid rain program we had, and could you kind of maybe compare that to what we're doing now with, with the cap and trade we're doing for the greenhouse gas reduction?
Okay. I can share with you what I know, my understanding. Okay. With the acid rain program, you did have a large majority of the allowances that were freely allocated. You also had some portion that were auctioned, and the primary reason for doing that auction was to provide some type of price signal to covered entities. The way that the acid rain program had that auction structured, they did it in a way so that it would be revenue neutral. So in other words, once the auction was complete, the proceeds were proportionately redistributed back to covered entities, again, so that you would not raise revenues.
So a model like that, I mean, and how did that work? Did it seem to be a positive influence on the economy? Did it achieve the objectives, or do you know that? You
may want to ask other folks their input on this, but okay, from what we've seen, it was a very successful program.
Okay, thank you.
It was successful in reducing sulfur dioxide. That's
so in other words, giving something back to, okay, I hear what you, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the challenge becomes, that I hope we will look at in the LAO, becomes a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Because so often in many of these things, it's, if we're going to spend, for example, $3 billion a year, what'd you get for it? It's clear, notwithstanding what you believe about global warming, that if California went to zero GHG, it wouldn't have any impact on the climate. If we went to, and we're not even going to zero, but if we went to zero, it would have no demonstrable impact on the climate. So what are we getting? I mean, this was one of the questions I was posing to Mr. Corey. What are we buying for $3 billion a year? What did I get? Now, if you say, well, we'll be more efficient and there'll be benefits to cleaner air, but that's not what this program was designed to do. The program was designed to do GHG. If you're saying, well, I'm also going to get the benefit of less sulfur or less nitrogen or less whatever in the air, well, that's a separate program. But the measurement of this program should be how much GHG did I reduce and what benefit did I achieve in so doing, and how much did I pay for it? You know what I'm saying? And the thing that I'm mindful of is I don't want someone to say to me, I mean, what becomes a common response is, well, we spent $3 billion a year, we prevented 42 million asthma cases, and therefore the $3 billion was offset by the reduction. The goal of the program wasn't to reduce asthma cases. You know what I mean? And what will happen is often it's kind of a sleight of hand. You got this, it's true we didn't achieve this, or we did achieve it and it didn't matter. But we spent $3 billion. I mean, and I was taken, and I'm not trying to, I mean, I said it to him. I mean, I don't know what economist could say that you could spend $3 billion a year over 8 years, that you'd spend $25 billion, and that would have no impact on the economy of California. That I mean, I don't know. I mean, that economist ought to be fired because, I mean, and again, where the money goes could have a dynamic. I mean,